The world has known plenty of tales of North Koreans risking everything to defect to the south. The barbed wire, the trigger-happy patrols, the frozen rivers. These have long been symbols of desperation and defiance. But have you heard of South Koreans fleeing the other way around and settling in the Northern Kingdom? Meet Choe Deok-sin, once a South Korean war hero, general, ambassador, even foreign minister, and later the highest-ranking South Korean ever to defect to North Korea. Yes, you heard that right. A decorated guardian of the South's anti-communist ramparts who one day packed his bags and said to his wife, "Buckle up, let's move to Pyongyang." Today, we journey through Choe Deok-sin's legendary life, from youthful freedom fighter to four-star turncoat. It's a tale woven through the turbulence of Korean history, from colonial oppression, the Second World War, the Korean War, to the South Korean military dictatorship and the ideological tug-of-war that forever split Korea. This story is full of plot twists. How did a loyal South Korean patriot become a prized comrade of Kim Il-sung? Let's dig in.
The white-robed gentleman with the funny hat is the main attraction. This fellow is a typical example of the native Korean. He bows to the dominion of Japan, but he firmly declines to admit the superiority of Japan's intellectual and moral culture over his own.
Our story begins long before the defection drama, in an era when Korea was under Japanese colonial oppression. September 17th, 1914. Choe Deok-sin is born in Uju County, a quiet town in what was then northwestern Korea. So technically speaking, he was from the northern side of the border. It was 4 years into Japanese colonial rule, and Korea had ceased to exist as an independent nation. It was the darkest of times, but also a time that created unlikely heroes. Choe entered the world to parents who were, to put it mildly, not content to live under Imperial Japan's boot. His father, Choe Dong-oh, was a prominent independence activist. This was a man who literally helped run the Korean Provisional Government in exile. In 1919, when Koreans rose in the March 1st movement against Japanese rule, Papa Choe was at the forefront. He got arrested for a month in a Japanese jail and became more determined after it. Soon after, he made his way to Shanghai, China, where he joined the Provisional Korean Government, plotting and lobbying for Korea's freedom from abroad. Now, here's an interesting footnote of history. One of the students at a military school that Choe's father ran for Korean guerrillas was a teenager by the name of Kim Sung-ju, better known later as Kim Il-sung. Yes, that Kim Il-sung, the future eternal president of North Korea, took lessons in perhaps bomb-making under Choe's dad in the early 1930s. So from the start, Choe Deok-sin's life was oddly intertwined with the man who would decades later welcome him to Pyongyang. Little Choe Deok-sin, meanwhile, spent his early childhood in Japanese-occupied Korea, likely hearing whispers of his father's exploits. In 1921, 7-year-old Deok-sin and his mother finally moved to China to join his father in exile. From that point on, young Choe grew up across the sea, living among fellow Korean patriots scattered in China and Manchuria, who were fighting the empire from afar. He was educated in the spirit of anti-Japanese resistance, which would become the bedrock of his identity.
On March 1st, 1919, after months of nationwide protests against Japan's ruthless colonial rule, Koreans declared their country free and independent. With the March 1st movement as a catalyst, Korean independence activists in Shanghai established a provisional government in April the same year, 9 years after Japan forcefully annexed Korea in 1910.
By the early 1930s, with Japan tightening its grip on East Asia, Korean exiles were desperate for allies. They found support from the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, which was also fighting the Japanese. After a daring Korean bombing of Japanese officers in Shanghai's Hongkou Park, the Chinese were impressed by how determined those Koreans were and started helping to train Korean freedom fighters. In 1933, at just 19, Choe got enrolled in the 10th class of the Whampoa Military Academy, the best military preparation school in China. There, he used a Chinese name and a fake Chinese identity paper, learned the art of soldiering under an assumed identity alongside Chinese comrades under the nose of Imperial Japan. He graduated in 1936 with distinction. Fluent in Chinese and, rather unusually for the time, German, the young officer first served as a translator at China's military headquarters before moving into staff positions in the field. Yet behind the uniform and the assignments, his loyalty lay elsewhere, with the dream of Korea's liberation. In 1940, when exiled Korean leaders formed the Korean Liberation Army, Choe transferred over to serve the Korean cause more directly. Don't get misled by its name. This Korean Liberation Force was created in Chongqing, China, and basically was a Korean legion in the Chinese army. There, he started as a propaganda officer, later rising to company commander under the legendary Chinese general Sun Li-jen. In the jungles of Burma, Choe Deok-sin led Korean troops as part of the Chinese Expeditionary Force, fighting shoulder to shoulder with Allied soldiers against the Japanese. It was brutal, wet, and unforgiving. Yet by the war's end in 1945, Japan surrendered and Choe successfully carved his place in history, wearing the rank of colonel in the Korean Liberation Army. So, you'd think that's the kind of resume that guarantees you a hero's welcome in a liberated homeland, right? Well, fate gave him a taste for irony.
The provisional government elected Lee Seung-man as its first president in 1919. An independence activist with a PhD from the United States, he later became the first president of South Korea in 1948. The last president of the provisional government was nationalist Kim Gu, who thought the only way to take back Korea was through armed force.
In August 1945, Japan's surrender brought an end to 35 years of colonial rule. Korea is free and suddenly divided at the 38th parallel by the victorious Allies. Our man Choe, after years abroad, must choose where to go. His hometown in the north is under Soviet control and poised to become part of a communist state led by his dad's former student. The south, meanwhile, is assembling a US-backed government under anti-communist figures like Syngman Rhee and many exiles from the provisional government. Given Choe's close ties to those exile networks, it's no surprise he opts to go south. In late 1945, Choe Deok-sin finally got back to Korea and was ready to help build a new nation. And here's where reality smacks him in the face. The South's nascent government and military, under American military administration, aren't exactly rolling out the red carpet for guys like Choe. See, in the paranoid early Cold War atmosphere, the Americans distrusted many of the Korean independence fighters, suspecting them of being Soviet contacts or socialist-leaning. Paradoxically, the US administration found it safer to rely on Koreans who had served in the Japanese army, who weren't heroes of liberation, but at least staunchly anti-communist. So Choe, the battle-hardened anti-Japanese guerrilla, finds the new South Korean army dominated by people he and his comrades once fought against. Many officers were former Imperial Japanese Army men, such as Park Chung-hee, who later became a military dictator in the 60s. To Choe, who nearly died fighting Japanese forces, it must have felt like the world turned upside down. When Choe entered the South Korean Armed Forces in 1946, his impressive colonel rank from the KLA turned against him. So Choe was demoted to second lieutenant, the very bottom of the officer ranks. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet Choe Deok-sin was nothing if not persistent. He also had a secret weapon, his family ties. His wife, Ru Mi-yong, came from a prominent family, and Che's father-in-law was a significant figure in the post-war military administration. Strings were pulled. Through a combination of sheer talent, grit, and a bit of nepotism, Che's fortunes began to turn. The South Korean army may have started him at the bottom, but he climbed ranks at a breakneck pace once given a chance. By 1948, South Korea officially became the Republic of Korea, and the US was pushing to build a stronger army to counter the communist North. In just 4 years, Choe zoomed from second lieutenant to full colonel again. He earned command of the Army's 30th Regiment and then an entire division. Think about that rise. It's the kind of promotion speed run only possible in the chaos of a new nation gearing up for war. Choe even got sent to the United States in 1949 for advanced military schooling, a sign that President Syngman Rhee's government saw him as a valuable asset. By June 1950, Choe Deok-sin was back home from his US training, just in time for all hell to break loose.
Men of the Republic of the South's army are preparing a mass execution. In a land riven by the hatred between a communist northern regime and a pro-Western southern government, such brutal punishments are commonplace on both sides.
On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, igniting the Korean War. The North's Soviet-equipped army smashes southward. The ill-prepared South Korean army, riddled with those ex-Japanese officers and short on heavy weapons, is in full retreat. Amid the chaos, Choe returns to a nation literally on fire. President Rhee, desperate and impressed by Choe's American military education, immediately assigns him to form and lead a brand new unit, the 11th Division. He's also jump promoted to Brigadier General on the spot. One day, he's unpacking his suitcases from America. The next, he's commanding thousands of men in a fight for survival. The war's early months are brutal. By autumn 1950, after US-led UN forces intervene and push the North Koreans back, Choe's 11th Division becomes instrumental in counteroffensives. But soon, Choe's story takes a dark turn. The North Korean army had left behind bands of communist guerrillas in the southern mountains to harass the south. As a newly minted general, Choe is tasked in late 1950 with wiping out these insurgents, especially around Jirisan, a rugged mountain area where guerrillas lurked. Something special to note. Right now, Choe has an intensely personal vendetta fueling him against the North. During the war's chaos, his father, Choe Dong-oh, had been in Seoul when the North first captured the city. Choe heard rumors that his father was executed by communist forces as a nationalist. Whether true or not, this filled Choe with a burning desire for revenge. The staunch anti-Japanese freedom fighter had now become an equally staunch anti-communist crusader. Choe Deok-sin threw himself into anti-guerrilla operations with zeal and ruthlessness. Drawing on his guerrilla life and the brutal tactics he'd seen Imperial Japan use in China, he formulated a scorched earth policy. The idea was simple and horrifying. Deny the guerrillas any support by destroying everything that could sustain them. If guerrillas are fish and the local population is water, as Mao Zedong once suggested, Choe was determined to boil the water until the fish had nowhere to swim. Villages accused of supporting partisans were emptied, homes burned, and food supplies seized or ruined. The goal was to leave nothing behind. In early 1951, Choe's 11th Division launched a sweeping operation through the mountain counties of Sancheong, Hamgyang, and Jeochang. The soldiers committed atrocities that would haunt Korea for decades. The most infamous was the Jeochang massacre. Over a few cold days in February 1951, troops from Choe's division, led by Colonel Oh Il-kyu and accompanied by a particularly trigger-happy Major Kim Jong-won, went from village to village around Jeochang. They were supposed to be flushing out guerrillas. Instead, they were torching houses and killing residents under suspicion of aiding the enemy. Houses were set ablaze, livestock slaughtered, and hundreds of unarmed villagers were executed in probably one of the darkest episodes of the Korean War. When the guns finally cooled, over 700 innocent people in Jeochang County lay dead. And that was just one county. Roughly 1,500 South Korean civilians were massacred by their own army in the span of that campaign. A grim testament to how vicious the war had become and how Choe's no mercy policy had spun out of control at the ground level. Now, if this were a just world, such an atrocity would end careers or land people in jail. Initially, the South Korean High Command did try to cover it up. They blamed the communists or brushed it off. But the scale was too large to hide. News leaked. Public outrage demanded an investigation. Under pressure, the government sent investigators. What followed next could be from its own dark comedy. To stall the inquiry, the aforementioned major disguised his troops as communist guerrillas and ambushed the investigators, killing a few of them, to give the impression the area is too dangerous. See, communist rebels everywhere. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Eventually, the Jeochang massacre was exposed. The public was horrified, and even the American advisors were appalled. General Choe Deok-sin, as the division commander who'd set the aggressive tone, was relieved of his post. He got his new title, the Butcher of Jeochang, not exactly what our aspiring Patriot had envisioned as his claim to fame. Though Choe himself hadn't pulled triggers, it was his command, his policy, and ultimately his responsibility. In the cold logic of war, he had become what he hated, a perpetrator of atrocities against Korean civilians. And yet, this dark chapter barely dented Choe's career prospects in the long run. It's striking how quickly the incident was swept under the rug by those in power. The South was far more interested in hunting down communists than punishing its own men for war crimes. The direct commander on the ground, Kim Jong-un, got a mere 3-year prison sentence for obstructing the investigation. And even this 3-year sentence was soon pardoned by President Syngman Rhee and went on to be promoted to National Police Chief. Compared to the real battleground butchers, Choe was essentially a patriotic general who had simply been overzealous and practically innocent. Within months, Choe Deok-sin was quietly reassigned to a prestigious role, Deputy Commandant of the Army Staff College. By the end of 1951, he became the principal of that college. The Butcher was now basically the head professor for all future South Korean military elite. In those days, remember, anti-communist fervor trumped human rights every time.
Uneasy peace, but peace withal, came to Korea in 1953. The end of 3 years of bitter conflict and the end of bondage for prisoners of the Reds. What lay ahead, no one could foretell at year's end, but for these men, at least, the shadow of death had lifted. They were alive in Freedom Village and going home.
In 1953, when the Korean War's guns finally fell silent with a shaky armistice, Choe served on South Korea's armistice negotiation delegation. Imagine this, a somber tent, North Korean and UN commanders facing each other across a table. Representing the South, in a crisp uniform, sits Choe Deok-sin, discussing ceasefire terms with his communist counterparts. On the opposite side is a North Korean general named Lee Sang-jo, who served as Deputy Chief of Staff and top negotiator. They signed the truce that halts the bloodshed, then go their separate ways. A few decades later, General Lee Sang-jo, the North Korean chief negotiator, defected to South Korea to flee from Kim Il-sung's rule. And by that time, as we'll see, Choe Deok-sin was living in Lee's former mother nation, up north. It's almost as if the two men swapped places in some cosmic joke about the Korean division. Anyway, after the war, Choe's star in South Korea kept rising. He became Vice Chief of Staff at the Defense Ministry in 1954, then a full Army Lieutenant General and Commander of the 1st Army Corps. By 1956, at age 42, he had achieved everything a military man could hope for, so he hung up his uniform. Choe retired from active duty and donned a new hat, Diplomat.
지난 17일 소홍 내각 수반은 최덕신 신임 외무부 장관에게 임명장을 수여했습니다.
Retiring from the military doesn't mean relaxation. Choe Deok-sin's skills were still in demand, just shifted to another area. South Korea in the late 1950s was poor, unstable, and diplomatically isolated. They needed capable envoys to win friends and funds. So Choe was dispatched abroad, first as ambassador to South Vietnam and then to Thailand, two critical capitalist allies of the United States. Then South Korea had a dramatic turn. Syngman Rhee's corrupt government was overthrown in 1960. After a year of chaos, a group of military officers led by a brash Major General Park Chung-hee, a brutal junta leader who once served in Japan's army, seized power in a coup d'etat on May 16, 1961. Park Chung-hee became the new strongman of South Korea, determined to modernize the economy and crush any communist influence, all under his authoritarian grip. Here comes a new opportunity for Choe. Park had a sentimental side. He revered his old teachers back in the school days. And guess who was the commandant of the military academy when Park was a student there? That's right, Choe Deok-sin. Park literally used to salute Choe in the halls of the Army College. To Park, General Choe was the embodiment of the patriotic, hard-nosed military tradition he admired. So when Park took charge of the country, he immediately pulled Ambassador Choe back from Thailand and handed him one of the most prestigious jobs in the new regime, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Suddenly, Choe Deok-sin was back in Seoul and in the inner circle of power. From 1961 to 1963, he played a key role in cementing South Korea's new alliances. He helped arrange Park's first state visits to the US and reopened long-stalled talks with Japan. Given Japan's colonial crimes, negotiating with the former colonizers was not easy for Choe. Nonetheless, under the direction of General Park, Choe was pushing to normalize relations with Japan to get economic aid.
Seoul, capital of Southern Korea. Riots on the scale of revolution. More was to follow, but it already looked like the end of the road for President Syngman Rhee. In earlier rioting, police killed 130 people, wounded close on 1,000. That only incensed the population. By now, 30,000 risked battle with the police. Not even a...
Choe had excellent diplomatic skills. As a former interpreter, he could charm foreign dignitaries in English, Chinese, and even German. But back home, he stepped into a snake pit. The junta under Park had many cliques and factions. Willingly or not, Choe had to face constant rivalries and potential purges. General Park was paranoid and ruthlessly consolidating power. Sadly, Choe wasn't a cunning politician. As a career military man, he was blunt, action-oriented, and famous for a straightforward, candid style. Choe quickly grew disgusted with the backstabbing and Machiavellian maneuvers among Park's lieutenants. In cabinet meetings, this guy says exactly what he thinks, in a room full of plotters speaking in secret code. After only a year and a half as foreign minister, Choe had had enough of the palace intrigue. In a rather unusual move for a top official, he basically said, "I'm too old for this nonsense." He voluntarily resigned his post and asked to be sent back overseas. Park, who still respected Choe but likely found him a bit too stern and independent-minded, so Choe Deok-sin was packed off to Europe as ambassador to West Germany, a comfortable exile for a disillusioned patriot. At first, this seemed like a win-win. Choe got to escape the cesspool of Seoul politics, and South Korea got an experienced hand in Bonn to manage relations with one of its few non-Asian partners. There, Choe oversaw the guest worker program for Seoul. At Park's behest, Choe negotiated agreements that sent tens of thousands of South Korean miners and nurses to work in West Germany. It was a desperately needed source of foreign currency, since the workers would transfer money home, and there was a technology transfer. The program itself was not bad. Cheap, efficient labour for Deutschmark and giant machines. It genuinely helped South Korea's economy. For a few years, life was calm. Choe Deok-sin played the role of elder statesman in Europe, sipping Riesling at diplomatic soirees and promoting Korean exports.
What started as a labor recruitment agreement became a cultural encounter and the beginning of a new life.
한국에서부터 산 거에 더블이나 다름없어요. 영원한 애국인입니다. 이렇게 말할 수
내 삶에 소중한 한때를 그때 보냈다라고 생각을 하죠.
그때로 돌아간다면은
Unfortunately, no candid man can escape from a dictator's suspicion, even if that dictator is from the south. In 1967, his ambassadorship was derailed by an espionage thriller come to life, the Koreans in West Berlin incident. South Korea's intelligence agency, the infamous KCIA, got wind of something alarming. They reported to President Park that nearly 200 South Korean students and expatriates in West Germany had been converted by North Korean agents, basically recruited to infiltrate South Korea and spread communism or gather intelligence. Park, ever the anti-communist hawk, was furious and authorized a secret operation. The KCIA, without telling Ambassador Choe, proceeded to kidnap a number of these suspected pro-North Koreans off the streets of West Germany and smuggle them back to Seoul. Oops. You can imagine how the West German authorities felt about foreign secret agents running around kidnapping people on their soil. When this came to light, it caused a big diplomatic scandal. The West German government demanded Seoul recall and replace the Korean ambassador, even though poor Choe was like, "Wait, what kidnappings? This is the first I'm hearing of it." It didn't matter. It was his watch, his responsibility. So in 1967, Choe's posting abruptly ended, not with accolades for securing all that labor migration and friendship, but in humiliation. Back in Seoul, President Park was also now looking at Choe through a suspicious lens. To Park's paranoid mind, the fact that North Korean spies allegedly infiltrated the Korean community in Europe on Choe's turf made the old general seem either incompetent or, worse, possibly complicit. Rumours swirled. Had Choe gone soft on communists? Why didn't he sniff out the spies among his countrymen in Germany? Was he secretly sympathetic to the Juche ideology? Park even confronted Choe, asking why he had allowed North Korean agents operating under his nose. It was a ridiculous insinuation. There was zero evidence Choe had anything to do with it. But in the climate of the time, guilt by accusation was enough. Choe was not punished, but something had broken between him and Park. The trust was gone. Park never quite looked at his former mentor the same way again, and Choe realized it. The distance grew between the once heroic teacher and his star pupil turned dictator. Unwittingly, the stage was set for Choe's final break from South Korea. Choe Deok-sin returned to Seoul in late 1967. Rather than quietly accept some domestic post, Choe did something dramatic. He quit public life altogether. He resigned from all government positions and effectively told Park's regime, "I'm out." For a 53-year-old retired general and ex-minister, what's next? In Choe's case, a rather unexpected third career: religious leader. In his youth, a patriotic religious group helped his father and funded those independence fighters. It's called Chondogyo, literally Religion of the Heavenly Way. A Korean new religious movement started in the mid-19th century, mixing native spirituality with bits of Christianity and nationalism. By the 1960s, it wasn't a huge religion, but it still had a following and a formal hierarchy. Choe Deok-sin, perhaps seeing an opportunity to do something meaningful, became the leader of Chondogyo, the seventh Dangun, or principal minister of the cult. To outside observers, it might have seemed a mellow semi-retirement gig, leading prayers, managing the faithful, writing sermons on heavenly harmony and Korean unity. But Choe, true to form, approached it like a man on a mission. He threw himself into running Chondogyo with the same vigor he'd once applied to running an army division. And the turnout wasn't exactly great. Choe's leadership style clashed with the nature of a religious organization. He was used to barking orders and making snap decisions, but now he was the head of an organization that ran on consensus, tradition, and frankly, tight finances. He launched ambitious projects and events, presumably to raise the cult's profile and attract new believers, but never knew how to finance the cult. As a public servant, budgeting and caution were never Choe's concerns. Soon, Chondogyo was bleeding funds, and internal discontent grew. Devotees and clerics muttered that Choe was autocratic and wasteful, and newspapers began publishing stories accusing Choe Deok-sin of mismanaging or even embezzling Chondogyo funds. Choe was furious. He felt slandered. He had dedicated his life to serving Korea, and now he was being painted as a corrupt cult leader. He looked for help to his old ally-turned-boss, President Park Chung-hee. Maybe Park's government could get the media off his back, or state support? Rather, Park gave him the cold shoulder. Why would Park help out a retired general whom he already suspected of being disloyal? For Choe, this was the final straw, the betrayal to end all betrayals. The loyal patriot now felt persecuted by the very country he helped build. He decided to do something no one of his stature had done: publicly break with the South Korean regime and get out. In February 1976, Choe got his chance. He travelled to Tokyo for a religious conference. It seems like a routine trip, but on February 17th, instead of just delivering a sermon, Choe dropped the bombshell. He called a press conference and declared he was renouncing the South Korean government and the Park regime. He would no longer return to South Korea. He defected from South Korea, but not yet to the Northern People's Republic, but to the free world. It was a dramatic firing your boss moment. I quit, and you can't fire me because I already quit. By his side was his wife, Roo Mi-young, as staunch and idealistic as he. The couple flew to the United States, where they sought political asylum and settled down as high-profile dissidents. If you're keeping score, by 1976, Choe had been, in order, a guerrilla fighter, a general, a diplomat, a minister, a religious chief, and now an exiled dissident. What a legendary career man! From America, Choe continued to speak out. He became a thorn in the side of the Park government, issuing statements and working with South Korean pro-democracy activists abroad. He teamed up with other exiled opponents of Park, united by a desire to see the end of authoritarian rule in Seoul.
The centre of Seoul this evening was a battleground between troops and students. The day of peaceful protests had ended in a hail of petrol bombs and a cloud of tear gas. Though activists taunted the police, most of the people caught up in the riot were innocent bystanders.
It's not going to come easy. It all takes some blood.
For a while, Choe's story could have ended there, a footnote as a disgruntled former official living out his days writing angry letters from abroad. But fate wasn't done with Choe Deok-sin, not even close. Now, a new character enters our drama, Choe Hong-hee, the founder of Taekwondo. General Choe Hong-hee had been a South Korean military man too, credited with creating Taekwondo and once serving as ambassador to Malaysia. At this time, Choe Hong-hee had also fallen out with Park's regime and gone into exile. The martial artist was bouncing between Canada, the US and, intriguingly, North Korea. He saw an opportunity to promote Taekwondo internationally by cooperating with the North. Choe Deok-sin and Choe Hong-hee eventually crossed paths. Two ex-ROK generals share the same surname and the same destiny. They struck up a friendship, and it was through this unlikely friendship that the truth about Choe's father emerged. Remember the dad, Choe Dong-oh, the independence activist who disappeared in 1950 in Seoul? Choe Deok-sin had lived the past 30 years believing his father was executed by Kim Il-sung's henchmen. It fueled his hatred and drove his ferocity in the war. Now, in the early 1980s, Chae Hong-hee passes him a startling bit of news. Your father wasn't slaughtered by the North. He was kind of a big deal up north. What? Chae probably thought it was a bad joke, but as Chae Hong-hee laid it out, it all made sense. During the chaos of the Korean War's early days, when the North Korean army overran Seoul, many important Southerners were captured. Some were executed, yes, but Kim Il-sung, recognizing Chae Dong-o's historical importance and perhaps remembering him as a teacher figure, spared his life. Kim brought Chae's father to Pyongyang, where the elder Chae lived out his days comfortably. And even when Chae Dong-o died in 1963, he was given a hero's funeral in Pyongyang, complete with a high-ranking attendance. Imagine Choe Deok-sin's reaction to this shocking revelation. For decades, he had cursed the North for murdering his father, only to find out his father had been in the North all along, possibly willingly. It's as if Chae's entire understanding of his family and the war was turned on its head overnight. This bombshell sparked a profound identity crisis. If his father wasn't betrayed by the North, had Chae been fighting the wrong enemy? What about all the brutal things he'd done in that war out of vengeance? Were those a terrible mistake? We can only speculate on his personal turmoil, but one thing is clear. Choe Deok-sin became intensely curious about North Korea. He wanted to know more, perhaps even see his father's grave, and hear from the North Korean side about what happened. With secret contacts with the Workers' Party's international department, arrangements were made. Sometime in the mid-1980s, Choe Deok-sin travelled to Pyongyang alone. It was an extraordinary gamble. He knew, as a former ROK general, and particularly one infamous for killing communist partisans, he could be walking into a trap or trial. The North had propagandized him for his butcher role decades earlier. Would they forgive that? But Chae went anyway, likely reasoning that if Kim Il-sung invited him, he'd be safe. What awaited him in North Korea must have been surreal. Kim Il-sung himself greeted Choe Deok-sin warmly in Pyongyang. The supreme leader, once a young guerrilla taught by Chae's dad, now played the magnanimous host to the son of his old mentor. Kim assured Chae that his past deeds would be forgiven, so long as Chae was now willing to work for the cause of Korean reunification under Kim's leadership. In essence, Kim offered Chae a path to redemption. Switch sides at this late hour and help advocate for North Korea's vision of one Korea. Do that, and all bygones are bygones.
Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il drew Koreans living abroad to the struggle for reunifying the country, which has been divided by the US imperialists. Kim Il-sung devoted heart and soul to the country's reunification.
Kim Il-sung was nothing if not shrewd. Having Choe Deok-sin on his team would be a huge propaganda coup. Former South Korean general and foreign minister rejects the South and embraces the North. That headline practically writes itself. It would lend credibility to the North's claim of being the true homeland for all Koreans, even elites from the South. Kim likely flattered Chae, appealing to his patriotism. In Pyongyang's telling, they were the true continuation of the anti-Japanese struggle that Chae and his father had been a part of. The South, by contrast, was painted as a sellout state, run by pro-Japanese collaborators and American lackeys. When you frame it like that, coming over to the North could be spun as a homecoming to the real Korea that Chae had always fought for in his youth. Chae didn't agree immediately. He made a few secret visits, sounding things out. Perhaps he had to convince himself and his wife that this was truly the right thing to do. By this time, mind you, North Korea's shine was fading. It was the mid-80s. South Korea was booming economically and about to host the Olympics, while North Korea's planned economy was stagnating. Defecting to the North in 1986 was not like doing so in 1950 or 1960. It was, frankly, bizarre, like someone leaving West Germany to go to East Germany on the eve of the Berlin Wall's collapse. But it still happens, just not often. In August 1986, he made his decision. Choe Deok-sin, aged 71, and his wife, Roh Mi-yong, announced that they would permanently reside in North Korea. The deed was done. Choe declared that upon seeing the North with his own eyes, witnessing its self-reliant, independent spirit, and the pride and dignity of the Korean people, he was deeply moved. In his view, the North was a truly autonomous Korean state, whereas the South he had left had been under foreign influence. It's the kind of rhetoric that surely made Pyongyang's propagandists beam.
Kim Jong-il felt sorry that the president's hair turned grey with his so many worries about the country's reunification. He emphasized the pressing need for Korean reunification. He said that if the divided country was handed over to the younger generation, neither nationalists in Korea nor compatriots abroad could say that they fulfill their duty to the country and nation.
When news of Choe's defection broke, the reaction in Seoul was utter pandemonium. Remember, South Korea in 1986 was not the fully free society it is today. It was under the iron-fisted rule of another general, Chun Do-hwan, Park's successor after the 1979 assassination. The country was on the cusp of democratizing, and it was extremely sensitive about its international image, especially with the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games around the corner. South Korean officials went ballistic. Seoul spokespeople loudly accused North Korea of playing the celebrity defector card in a bid to undermine the South. They framed Choe's move as a North Korean psychological ploy timed to mess with Seoul's Olympic preparations and to one-up South Korea just as it was gaining global prestige. One narrative they pushed, Choe was broke and bitter, and North Korea bought him off. They alleged Choe had financial issues and that he went to Pyongyang basically to enjoy a cushy retirement on Kim Il-sung's dime. Another claim that Choe had been some sort of North Korean agent all along, or at least a useful idiot, stirring up trouble within South Korean society for years with North Korean backing. Behind closed doors, South Korea's intelligence agency was enraged and contemplated extreme measures. How could a former foreign minister slip into the North? According to later reports, they explored plans to either kidnap or assassinate Choe Deok-sin to avenge this humiliation. Ultimately, wiser heads prevailed, perhaps fearing North Korean retaliation or an international incident that could jeopardize the upcoming Seoul Olympics. South Korea decided to swallow the bitter pill and not pursue a cloak-and-dagger solution. Up north, meanwhile, Choe Deok-sin was given a hero's welcome and a brand new lease on life. He became the chairman of the Central Committee of the Chondoist Chongu Party, the North Korean political wing of the Chondogyo religious group. Choe also made himself a delegate to the Supreme People's Assembly and was named the vice chairman of the Committee for the Peaceful Reunification of the Fatherland, a mouthful propaganda statement urging the South to overthrow their government and unify under Kim Il-sung's loving embrace. In short, Pyongyang put Choe to work as a propaganda symbol. One has to wonder what Choe really thought in those final years. Was he content, believing he'd finally chosen the righteous side of history? Or did he realize he'd merely switched one propaganda machine for another? We do know he maintained his zeal for Korean unification until the end, perhaps genuinely convinced that he could better push for it from the north. Choe Deok-sin's extraordinary life came to an end on November 14, 1989, when he died in Pyongyang at the age of 75. North Korea, unsurprisingly, gave him a send-off befitting a state hero. They organized a formal funeral with full honors. Kim Il-sung himself attended the memorial service, a rare honor that signified just how much Kim valued this defector's symbolic value. Choe was buried in the Patriot cemetery in Pyongyang, a resting place for those the regime deems to have served the nation gloriously. North Korean state media portrayed Choe as a lifelong patriot who had wandered in the wilderness of the betrayed South, but in his final years found the true path of patriotism under the wise leadership of the great leader Comrade Kim Il-sung. In the regime's narrative, Choe's life was a redemption arc. And you might think that's the end of the Choe family saga. But remarkably, history had one more chapter to add, 30 years later.
A South Korean man has travelled illegally to Pyongyang for permanent relocation, according to North Korea's propaganda website 우리민족끼리 on Sunday. The 73-year-old man named Choe Deok-sin arrived in the North Korean capital on Saturday, with photos showing he was welcomed by local officials. He was quoted as saying that he'd follow the path of his parents.
Fast forward to 2019. The Korean peninsula has changed in many ways. The Cold War is long over. South Korea is now a vibrant democracy, one of Asia's wealthiest countries, known more for K-pop and tech exports than military coups. North Korea, meanwhile, has gone through famine, nuclear saber-rattling, and the rise of Kim Il-sung's grandson, Kim Jong-un. And then, in July 2019, out of the blue, South Koreans read a bewildering headline. Ex-foreign minister's son defects to North Korea. Wait, what? Who? It was almost too strange to believe. But it was true. Choe Deok-sin, the son of Choe Deok-sin, quietly flew from China to Pyongyang on July 6, 2019, and announced he would live there permanently, just like his parents did over 3 decades prior. Choe Deok-sin was in his early 70s, about the same age his father was when he went north. He had been a South Korean citizen all his life, living in Seoul relatively low profile. Despite his parents going north in the 80s, he was only watched closely by authorities, but not punished, for whatever his papa and mama did. In Pyongyang, North Korean media gave Choe Deok-sin the full celebrity arrival treatment. Cameras filming him receiving a bouquet at the airport, and even a video of him giving a short statement. With a slight North Korean accent, Choe Deok-sin proclaimed that returning to the embrace of the motherland, where his family's roots were, was an act of fulfilling his late parents' wishes and his duty as a son and a patriot. He spoke of dedicating himself to achieving Korean reunification, completing the mission his parents had pursued. One can only imagine the facepalms at the Ministry of Unification in Seoul. It wasn't as strategically significant as his father's defection. Choe Deok-sin wasn't a big official or anything, but symbolically, it was astounding. Here was a man, born and raised in South Korea, who voluntarily moved to one of the most isolated and repressive states on earth in the 21st century, citing ideological and familial reasons. With Choe Deok-sin's journey north, the Choe family achieved a unique hat-trick: grandfather, father, and son. 3 generations, each defected to North Korea in 3 different eras. It's an unimaginable family saga that you couldn't make up. Where most families were tragically split between North and South against their will, the Choe family chose across generations to congregate in the North, defying the general direction of the population flow. So what do we make of Choe Deok-sin's life? For North Koreans, he is a hero, a patriotic martyr who recognized the rightful government of Korea. For many South Koreans, he is a traitor, a man who abandoned his country in favor of an oppressive dictatorship. For others, he is a tragic figure, a man of principle who was whiplashed by history, and who never found a nation that lived up to his ideals. Choe always acted from conviction rather than calculation. He fought Japanese colonizers and risked his life for liberation. He rose quickly in the South Korean army and was willing to implement ruthless policies to suppress communist insurgents. He became the foreign minister and negotiated with former colonizers for his country's benefit. When he felt betrayed by authoritarian leaders in Seoul and maligned by the press, he walked away. When he learned that his father had been welcomed by North Korea, he re-examined his beliefs and decided to risk everything to follow in his father's footsteps. Each decision was extreme and ultimately contradictory to earlier actions. He was a general who became a butcher of his own civilians, and then a champion of peace in the north. He was a patriot whose vision of patriotism shifted radically over the decades. Choe Deok-sin's story tells us that the Korean divide is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a story of personal loyalties, ideological fervor, family histories, and changing geopolitical winds. The same man can be lauded and loathed depending on the circumstances. At the end of his life, Choe found the home he had been seeking. Whether it was the home he imagined in his youth is another question. The Korea he left in 1986 transformed into a prosperous democracy. The Korea he embraced stagnated under the Kim dynasty. But perhaps the measure of a man is not whether his choices prove wise in hindsight, but whether he lived according to his convictions. In that sense, Choe Deok-sin was unfailingly honest with himself, no matter how much others disagreed with him.